Welcome to the newest episode of Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. I'm your host, Jason Fraley, picking the brains of the top filmmakers, musicians, and artists of our time. This weekend marks the 75th anniversary of A Streetcar Named Desire, making its Broadway debut on December 3rd, 1947, starring the great Marlon Brando. I discussed Brando's career in depth with filmmaker Stephen Riley during the release of his 2015 documentary, Listen to Me, Marlon. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. Nice to speak to you guys.
What was your personal connection to making the movie? Were you a huge Brando fan, or what? What was the tie?
No, in fact, I'd seen his films and was knew him as a great actor and impressed by all the top roles like Godfather, Last Tango, It's Now. But I didn't know too much about him at all. The way I got involved was actually the production company, who I've worked with a few times before, called me up and said, what are you up to? Would you be interested in doing a film on Marlon Brando? So it was a very open brief at that point because the access was in place. The Brando family and the Brando estate were happy that a film would take place, with the right approach and the right director. And then it was up to me to kind of just really figure out what was the way into this man's life. And to really understand him, and there was a lot for me to get my head around because the further I got in, the more complex and contradictory he revealed himself to be. But it was a fascinating journey. It was a great research process, and I was fortunate to have the chance to make it.
Now, you kind of, right there, you just mentioned kind of two different things here. First was the access to all this unseen and unheard archive of footage from his family. And then the other part was how you then, deciphered all of that and found your little angle at it. So let's talk about the first part, your access. How did you get the ability to access all this archive here? Well,
it just so happened that the Brando estate were sort of figuring out their entire act, really. I suppose it had been 10 years since Marlon had passed away, and a lot of the boxes and his personal effects and archive had just been in storage that entire time. So coincidentally, as the possibility of the film came around, all of these being unpacked. And everything from, that remained of Marlon's personal effects, and that includes documentation and, things of furniture, ornaments, and also, these tapes, audio and visual, were just coming out and coming to the surface. So, that was one of the first questions that I asked is, what do we have access to? And I was included these tapes, and I listened to a first handful, and kind of sort of in the course of doing my first month's research and trying to figure out an approach, I just started questioning, how interesting it would be if the story was told entirely in Marlon's own words, because he had been so private and hadn't given those interviews during the course of his life. That that would be an amazing attempt at an approach to the film. But I just didn't know that was at all possible right then, because there ended up being about close to 300 hours of audio tapes that came out of the boxes eventually, but wasn't obvious straight away. But thankfully it all worked out, and the materials ended up being there, and with a lot of hard work, Marlon is the only voice in the film, and he could tell his entire life story,
So you wanted it to be something where it's not outside talking heads. It's basically Brando on Brando. That was kind of the concept.
Yeah, exactly, and it was an exciting prospect initially to not go that talking head route.
Sure. Yeah.
But and it was just great to be able to fulfill that. I ended up going about the film in a regular way as far as I approached stuff. That I read all the books. I went out to the States and met all of his family and friends and work colleagues who I could possibly get, who would sit down with me, and I could talk about him and really try and get to the essence. That was really incredibly useful eventually. having those notes. I just took them as notes on my phone, and because it allowed me to penetrate the material in a meaningful and understand, and with a degree more understanding than I would have had otherwise.
Awesome, yeah. I'm really interested in how you went about structuring the doc, balancing stuff about his personal life and his professional life. Like, do you intersperse film clips at all, or is it mostly just his personal life?
There's a mix of stuff, really. I mean, in terms of the spaces in the film. I mean, narratively, there's three ages of Brando, which are all very much interdependent, because so much of his later experience and the things which happened in his life and his character was dictated, as for all of us, by our early years. So there's the tale of Brando the young boy, Brando the actor, and then also Brando the old man living in Mulholland, in a fairly reclusive mode that we know of, that we're familiar with. So that was something which was already part of the original conception, as was this idea of the film being a psychoanalysis.
Right.
Where Brando was trying to figure out all of the whys and wherefores of his own character, and specifically as well how the tragedy which happened in his house in Mulholland, which a lot of people know about, where his daughter's boyfriend was shot by his son.
Yeah.
And his son had shot his sister's boyfriend.
Yeah.
In the family house. And the film is almost a deconstruction of how that event could have ever have come to pass, for somebody who was so thought out and philosophical, and as Marlon was, and someone who was just trying to keep her figure out the problems of ourselves and our character. How could this terrible thing have happened in his own home?
Right.
So that was part of the that's part of the narrative too, an investigation into that.
Do you save that until the third chapter, third act, or do you kind of introduce it early, Sunset Boulevard style, and then come back around to how it came to be, kind of thing?
I guess, yeah, kind of. You see it early on, and then there's echoes of it exactly in that way, and it's somewhat of a Freudian study too, because in order to understand how that happens, you have to go back to Marlon's childhood.
Love it.
As well, to see what it's a generational tale as well.
Let's kind of move through those three chapters one by one. So I mean, because now you just brought up Marlon's childhood. What are some of those Freudian things in that first act of his life that you think that led to some of these things later in life that you just referred to?
Well, he had a very turbulent childhood, without a doubt. I mean, his mum and his dad were both drinkers. His mum was she was an alcoholic, and his dad was that was violent towards his mother and violent towards him as well sometimes. So for somebody as sensitive as Marlon, he's had massive repercussions, and he says, steady telling me that he thinks that we spend our entire lives trying to overcome the problems and bad habits established in the first 10 years of our life.
Totally.
So a lot of that is, those repercussions are felt through the film, and he was a very,
That's the whole Rosebud argument, man. I mean, that's it, man. It's what happens when you're young. I mean, that's on your deathbed, you're still thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, and actually, and almost like your past is inescapable.
Yeah, that's true.
Of it, which you have no control over, and only with the hardest work can you ever seek to overturn that kind of the effects of that.
So it's kind of fatalistic in that sense, like it's already destined.
Yeah, well, he had, I think, and this is one of the questions he really analysed, and certainly in the course of his life in the film as well. But I know that was a big question with, and how much power do we really have? And
right.
But equally. He was getting involved in, as is heard in the tapes in the film, in self-hypnosis and self-therapy, and he was really trying to, correct those wrongs and to, in some way, parent himself give himself the parenting which he felt he never had.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy stuff.
Mm.
Let's move into the professional part of his career. What does he have to say about kind of sort of his big break and leap from Broadway to Hollywood?
Well, he just, everyone sort of says, oh, Brando should have done more stage acting, and what a waste, and, God, he threw his talent away. But you discover actually the trials and the difficulties that an actor like Brando, who pioneered the method, who was bringing so much of his own life into his parts. It was tough work. It was just too hard for him to play Stanley Kowalski every night, who was a violent drunk, a character who was quite familiar to him. But when he in Streetcar broke all records at that point and was a massive runaway Broadway success. But after 2 years in that, I think it broke him down, and he the last thing he ever wanted to do was get involved in the theatre. But he was, and I'm convinced he was an artist. He really wanted to excel in his craft, and as much as he would disparage acting and became very disillusioned, deeply disillusioned at many points. When he had the fire in his belly, he really wanted to do great things, and I think he understood that he could reform cinema, and he wasn't impressed by the previous generation of actors. Who he felt were far too stilted and overly dramatic, and with just stiff in their role play, and he wanted to bring in a much more manneristic and naturalistic and truthful form of acting, and that's the revolution with which he's credited, because his early roles, including in The Men and Viva Zapata and Streetcar Named Desire, were revolutionary in film, and he achieved what he wanted to set out to do, what he set out to do in movie making, and nothing's been the same since.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned about how he thought, he wasn't impressed with the previous generation, and then here in Streetcar, he's working for Kazan, so he knows this, familiar, face that helped him pioneer what he was doing in theater, and then he gets to Hollywood, and he's working right across the screen from the total different acting style. She is that very traditional style that you said he didn't really respect, and here he was this new method force on the scene. So what does he have to say in the documentary? Does he have anything to say about what it was like, those two clashing styles in Streetcar?
He didn't speak about Vivien Leigh specifically. I mean, you mentioned the pair of them. I mean, when I watched, and I hadn't seen Streetcar, which goes to show, I had a lot of research to do. I hadn't seen Streetcar before I started researching the movie, the documentary. I saw that scene, the opening scene where Blanche meets Stanley. Yeah. And that right there just explains everything. You can just see in just the way he carries himself versus, the doyen of the old school, Vivien Leigh, what the revolution would be. But no, in terms of talking specifically about, Vivien in that moment, he doesn't, but he certainly has a lot to say about the characters like Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart, who he thought were formulaic, and he said they were playing themselves. He said that they weren't actually character actors in a way. And actually, that was the one revealing thing to me in terms of finishing, the research and the move of the film, was that he. There's been no one like Brando, and I think obviously he's put on his own pedestal, but he was he never played. He got too bored playing himself. Right. And when you see that he got an Oscar for playing an Italian American in The Godfather. He also got an Oscar for playing a Mexican in Viva Zapata. He played an Englishman, and by the way, he's taking on the accents for all these characters as well. He's not just coming in with his own voice and a different costume. He's actually trying to really play cross-cultural roles and to try and really understand the tics and habits and mannerisms of an entire culture. That's where he studied, and I really can't name, even to this day, many actors who were nearly as brave as him. The gamut of roles which he attempted was quite extraordinary, and not since repeated, I don't think.
Absolutely, and there's so many great ones, and I want to be able to just touch briefly on him because I know our listeners, that's the meat of this that they're going to want to hear. Like, oh, what did he have to say about On the Waterfront and Godfather? So, but if let's have fun with it. Is there a way we can kind of move through them just sort of quickly? I'll maybe I'll mention one of the roles and you can give me something, maybe an interesting tidbit from the doc that he had to say about it. We mentioned Streetcar. How about On the Waterfront? What cool insight about that? I mean, that to me that might be his career role. I mean, well, other than The Godfather.
Well, what's fascinating, oh, by the way, sorry, on that earlier thing, can you correct it? He didn't get an Oscar for Viva Zapata. He got an Oscar nomination. Right. Obviously, but he got the an Oscar for.
He won for On the Waterfront. Yeah.
But what was fascinating about On the Waterfront was that he was so despondent and depressed on watching the film.
Really?
And he thought that it wasn't. Yeah, he was not impressed at all with his acting, and thought that he could have done a much better job. And then was actually very surprised when the film won an Oscar. And then he goes into this deep inquiry into, then how did that come to pass? How can I think it was so bad and yet the audience loved it? And then he starts exploring the idea of mythology and the power of myth. And he had this idea that developed that the actor shouldn't get in the way of the story, and that it's the audience who is acting. The audience feels they could have been a contender. The audience feels inferiority. Everyone's had that moment, or he just felt that he was a conduit for that rather than responsible for it.
That's so wild to me that, because we all look back at it, how many, it was 1954, so decades later, and we view it as one of the great, movie performances ever. But it's just wild to me that he could walk off set and think he failed at it. Did he? I mean, even giving the famous speech, it could have been a contender. It was you, Charlie. He wasn't even pleased with that.
Well, there was. I think he was pleased with the eventual outcome of that, because in the end, Kazan had chosen his version of it, because they were going to go about it a few different ways. And one thing for that particular scene, which I think it's been written about, and it's almost it's one of those anecdotes of things that have been retold. But certainly when Brando describes it, yes, it was a bit of an ad hoc. Improvised taxi cab in the back of a lot that was a pickup shop, effectively.
They threw the Venetian blinds in the back.
They put a curtain over the back so they couldn't do a rear projection, and then they set about just trying to figure the scene out in a very short amount of time, and I think the original script had it that he was going to be threatened with the gun, and Brando was going to react. I forget whether in an intimidated or an angry way, but actually it was Brando who said that he would have just been disappointed that his brother could have sunk to that level, and that was his improvisation on that. And so he just gently, that was the emotion of that scene when Brando set that up.
It's such a better reaction too, and he gives that look. He's like, really, my brother Charlie, you really gonna do this? It was you, Charlie. I mean that, but that's Brando. He's bringing the whole tone to that scene. You're saying?
Well, absolutely. And I think what's more reflective in Brando's disappointment, his own disappointment, he watches the film and thinks, God, that could have been better. It says a lot about Brando's own perfectionism.
Yeah. For sure.
He really did care, and he knew a good performance. He could have done better, and he was always striving for that. And that's not something which he would, often want other people to know about necessarily, because that was another point of vulnerability.
Right.
He did care about that stuff. And he always, even in the roles which we wouldn't have really considered, I think he often went into them with good intentions. Sometimes needing the money, but when he committed to something, I think he always wanted to give it his best shot, even when it would on some occasions fire. But I think when you're as brave an actor as him and you're trying such different things as he was, he would attempt, then you'd miss.
Absolutely. Well, Waterfront, one of the great movies of all time. And then the very next year, basically to your point about how he took on such a broad range of roles, the very following year he does Guys and Dolls, and he's doing a musical. With Sinatra. And what was it like for him to rev up for that kind of a role? That's a totally new challenge compared to the previous film roles he had.
I think that role for him, was, and that was his first really big Hollywood movie. Of course, he's already won an Oscar at this point, but that was the one with that was a big budget movie,
Right.
And it was a new experience for him. But I think in another respect, it was a respite because he'd had a lot of very heavy roles. His first 5 films were pretty intense, and the subject matter was quite heavy. So the chance to something that was light and to stretch his range as an actor. And again, he was thinking about, he always dismissed that, acting was something that he got into accidentally, and there was a degree of accident, but there was a lot of design there. And, he was already starting to think about, the breadth of his roles and his range. I think and comedy was something that he hadn't done.
Right.
So he threw himself into it, but it was a bit of a poison chalice because it was after that his fame really exploded.
Yeah.
And obviously he was popular at that point, but then he became like it just hit a much bigger audience, that size of movie, than his other stuff did, and and fame was the one thing that would really catch up with him by the end of his and torment him, I think, in his later years.
Absolutely. Does he talk at all about, just moving chronologically a little bit, does he talk about One-Eyed Jacks, his directorial effort? I think the one and only, right?
He did, yeah. I mean, he did actually. I mean, there are clips of One-Eyed Jacks in the film, and as it happens, I was keen to find a way to actually look into that, or at least, but the visuals are there. But I mean, it's one of my favourites actually, and I know there are some of his films that I discovered when directing the doc, and that was one of them. And I think it's fantastic Western. He directed it, showed a lot of skill in that. There's some famous about how the edit was taken away from him, and that upset him greatly. But even with that, and even with it not being the cut, I think he was most keen on. There's no denying how good a film it was.
Is that why he never returned to it? But because he didn't get final, carte blanche at the end?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he was he had there was just pressure for him to be out of the edit room.
Yeah.
He was wrestling with it. It had gone over it, and he'd spent the cut was still quite long when he was whittle it down, but people ran out of patience, and the studio took it away from him, and that was just soul destroying for him because he'd actually put in a hell of a lot of work into it. But despite that, it's still a great film. I think it's Scorsese's favourite Western as well, actually. Martin Scorsese.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's. I always found it a curious case with a guy like Brando in One-Eyed Jacks, or Charles Lawton with Night of the Hunter. It's like, how do these super huge actors, and they try to go behind the camera, and it's a one-off, and they decide this isn't for me. But decades later, we look at both of them as freaking masterpieces. So that's just fascinating to me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, his skills in directing and writing are just much undersold.
Mm-hmm.
You got much more than an actor with Brando.
Yeah.
And it's touched in the film, certainly with looking at the scripts of Apocalypse Now, but he would just rewrite stuff. He'd have it in his contract where he could have the ability to change his lines. And, because he would improvise so much, and it was always a studied improvisation.
Sure.
I would not be at all surprised if he had a lot of those thoughts and ideas in his mind before he even arrived on set. But he would craft things and deliver interpretations on characters and change the script in much more interesting ways than often much more interesting ways than the writers had originally put down. And so that was a feature of many of his films, including The Godfather. He changes the script a lot. When you get the original script and you watch that film, you see how many lines that Marlon's changed himself and how much value he's added. And the famous thing, in The Apocalypse Now, was that he, which I found fascinating, and it was that the entire lighting of that was at Marlon's request.
You mean the final, the horror scene in the compound?
Yeah, well, most of that stuff, that indoor material where there's shafts of light and Marlon moves between the light and the darkness.
Like half-lit faces and stuff. Yeah.
Kurtz. Yeah, that was all coming from him, and that's his instinct, coming through there.
That's great. Yeah, I want to get to Apocalypse in a second, but you mentioned The Godfather. Clearly, I mean, the role that most people of all generations are, will remember him for. Did he have any similar reservations, as you said he did with Waterfront, in terms of, he thought he stunk up the joint and wound up winning an Oscar? I mean, he wound up winning for The Godfather, but did he know this was going to be huge?
At that point, there's no doubt that he actually was pretty. He was in need of the role, and he was in need of money. He had lots of dependents from different relationships, and children, and had an archipelago in the South Pacific to pay for. And he needed work, and actually, in a lot of the phone calls, the phone had stopped ringing, and a lot of the work had dried up because a series of films in the 60s hadn't really done at all well. Yeah. So there was a degree of urgency to actually to get a role and to do something good just to pay the bills. So but he talks about an insecurity that he had, that he didn't know whether he was going to be right for that part and whether he could play it.
Yeah.
And he had to find that role and really weigh in. Yeah. And I just thought it was really interesting, as he would often do, he'd bring to best, readings and thoughts and ideas that he was interested in, that he was reading into outside of film, and one was the nature of good and evil. In fact, this was something which occupied him for, I think, other roles as well, but I think it reached its apogee in The Godfather, where he just was analysing the nature of the hero, and he thought, how fascinating it would be to tell the story of a gangster, not that he was a bad man, but that he was very gentle. Yeah. And just trying to get us to question our own ideas about, what is good and bad, what is evil, what right do we have to judge people too quickly. And that was, his one of his ways in, and he did see it as a capitalist tale. I mean, obviously the film's quite different to the book. And does go in different directions, including Marlon's character, and again he was responsible for that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that he in his own life, his personal life, was very aware and grappled with the concept of this fatalistic idea of how much power we actually have over our own life, or are we kind of destined to this doomed ending that's already been written before we even were born. Was he? I mean, I feel like this is all over The Godfather. I mean, this is Michael Corleone, the one son that he doesn't want to go into the family gangster life. Why? No matter what Vito does, Michael, it's almost like fate. It's in the stars that he's destined to come back around and become exactly like him, except way more evil. Especially in part 2. Was he? Do you think he saw parallels between that sort of fatalism in Coppola's vision versus his own life?
It's interesting. In terms of specifics, I can't think of any, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. On that, I mean, I think he was somebody who was, despite the fact that he had, a troubled upbringing of his own, he had a deep family and a deep aspiration to be within, a functioning family that was, clearly a departure from what he'd grown up with. Yeah. So I think he'd have had he certainly felt a deep sense of obligation and tie and the gravity of the family and the fate that might then include. That you're almost at the mercy of the fates when you're dealing with things like issues like you're dealing with obligations of duty, to your family.
Yeah. So when he says lines like a man that doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man, it rings very personal to him, huh?
Well, that's it. And and to be honest, I mean, again, it's just timid to find out whether Marlon had come up with that line himself, but it'd be interesting to look into that, because that's the kind of stuff he would do.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at the script of The Godfather, there are definite changes that came with it.
Did he explain his Sachin Littlefeather Oscar acceptance speech where he didn't show up and sent the Native American to accept it, who wasn't really a Native American, right? What was that whole controversy? Did he talk about that in the movie?
He does. He talks about yes, that definitely features, because the cause of the Native American Indian was so dominant in Marlon's life, and a cause which he was faithful to for.
Why do you think that was?
Decades. I think he really was wrestling with questions of his own conscience from an early age.
Right.
I think he really he asked, how am I my brother's keeper?
Right.
And he felt that he should, that it was his job as in the course of his life to find truth and also to do the right thing. And very early on, from a young age, he was always on the side of the light. And I find it fascinating, his journey in his life, where he actually ends up becoming, from being so idealistic, not just in his acting, he really wanted to find truth, but he also wanted to find truth for humanity and find a better way and mode for us all to live together in peace. And by over the years, it slipped, that idealism, and ended up becoming something a bit more nihilistic. Coincidentally, around the time of Apocalypse Now, where he felt that actually we were doomed in a sense, because our own essential nature was animalistic, and we were doomed to hurt each other. And it infected his acting as well. He felt that that truth was a far-flung pursuit, and that life is a lie as well, and acting is a lie. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of idealism early doors. I mean, in his life, I think he really wanted to make sure that he helped other people, and he did actually stick faithfully to the cause of the underdog. I think anyone who was oppressed, anyone who was in any way put upon and downtrodden, he felt an immediate sympathy for, because that's how he felt when he was a kid. Yeah. When he felt like he was the outsider. His family were the sort of persona non grata in town because his mum was somewhat notorious for her being the town drunk, and he felt as if he really fit in and had an empathy for others who didn't as well. And that's he leads to the American Indian cause, and felt that the American society had to address that hypocrisy. Yeah. The American, the American ideal of being virtuous and freedom seeking,
a melting pot and all that. The ideals are there, but we haven't always lived up to it, is what he's saying.
Pretty much, exactly. And that was and he wanted to just make sure that we were aware of that, or the Americans rather addressed it, and would give the rightful apology and compensation to Native American Indians, many of whom were his friends.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think those hypocrisies and corruptions from all levels are just woven so beautifully into the Godfather movies. I mean, I think that's why they're arguably the greatest ever done. But did he explain why he didn't come back for part 2? Because they had to redo the whole ending there so that he wasn't on screen. When they have the flashback.
No, it's not. It's not in the documentary, and I know that. But I think it was. I think it might have been for money matters.
Oh, okay.
He didn't get paid a lot at all for Godfather, and actually sold his stake in it for nothing. He got an upfront payment to actually cashed in any equity in the film. So he didn't really make much from Godfather 1 at all. So when he wanted, he was seeking some compensation for that. In Godfather 2, I don't think they were ready to done top down.
Yeah, it's such a shame too, because there's in so many ways part two, expands upon and is just almost an equally, if not better, film too. And it's so beautiful to see, Pacino intercut with De Niro playing the younger Brando. But man, if they could have also had Brando in there, it seems such a shame if they couldn't have almost done the three-way parallel story. That would have been insane. But be that as it may, beggars can't be choosers. They're amazing flicks. What was his thoughts on Coppola? But between The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, what were his thoughts as a filmmaker? I mean, to me, the guy was a visionary genius.
I think there were a few directors that he very much respected. Certainly Kazan, Gio Pontecorvo, he had a lot of respect for, even when they did a film called Burn. And that's one of his. That was his favourite film, in fact, Burn. And also Bertolucci, I think he had a lot of respect for, and then Coppola. I think those four directors, among all of them, were the ones that Brando felt most affinity towards. And but he was not impressed with Coppola's behaviour, certainly around the time of Apocalypse Now, because there was that article in Life magazine where Coppola had talked in disparaging terms about Brando's commitment to the role, that he was time wasting, that he arrived on set and he was overweight, and they really didn't appreciate, upset by that, because he felt that he'd saved Coppola in the course of making that film. Because the script wasn't fully formed, and it was on the basis of it was rewritten by Brando. And I was listening to the tapes that Brando recorded, which included all the preparations for the character of Kurtz, and again very different from the original script. And Brando was bringing in a lot of the stuff that he was interested in, and should definitely be given a lot of credit for reforming that last act.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he felt there was a minor betrayal, or not, if not major betrayal, by Coppola in not recognizing that.
So was all that stuff true then? That, I mean, I've always heard those stories, and there was the great documentary about it, Hearts of Darkness, Filmmaker's Apocalypse, I think it was called. That was shot by Coppola's wife. But was all that was it true about how he showed up? He hadn't even read the Conrad book. I think I heard somewhere that he was overweight. I mean, was any of that true? But also, I mean, he also thought that Coppola, should have overlooked that, because he did, and in the end, save his movie, save his Act 3.
Well, there was all sorts of things going on around that. There were money issues again. Brando wanted to get his agreed payment up front. Coppola wasn't in the position to pay it. There had been a lot of Brando had been leaning on Coppola for that payment. So that was a separate issue that was affecting things. But even when you watch Hearts of Darkness, there's there's an anomaly in there. When, because Coppola admits that it was a complete nut house, and the entire production had hit the rocks, and he didn't have a script, and he says, well, what do you do in that situation? Do you go away and spend months writing a script, or do you do improvisations with Marlon Brando? He even says that in the film. So the fact that that it went over by a couple of weeks, and Brando's rewriting it for him, I think is it just seems a bit hypocritical that you can't have your cake and eat it and say that I want to do improvisations. They take a bit longer. And difficult. There's no question. I think he would if he didn't like a director, or if he lost faith in the production, he could play up. He could be. But it was always. It was often from a point of, not always from a point of petulance. It was because he actually cared and felt, and he felt that things were going to go that weren't going according to the high hopes that he really would have originally have had. In this instance, I just think that I just, on balance, and I love Coppola, and I love his. I mean, God, he is hero in terms of the films that he's done. But on just this topic of Brando and Coppola and their relationship and Apocalypse Now, I think there's more to be said on that.
Interesting.
And I think Brando deserved his comeback, which he gets in the film, and he talks about it.
That's very, very fascinating. I mean, yeah, like you, I've always admired Coppola's work, big time, right up there with any other filmmaker. But you always hear the stories about Brando being unprepared on Apocalypse Now, but it's nice to hear sort of the other side in his own words of, hey, buddy, I was rewriting everything. Was the horror was that his improv line, or was that actually in the original script? Do you know?
So that particular, I don't know. All I can tell you is that that there were tapes and tapes and tapes where Brando was just ad-libbing into a dictaphone, and is just exploring, the logic of deep evil.
kind of like Kurtz in the movie.
Exactly, just that, yeah. Because the original character of Kurtz, when you see it, was almost like a reprobate. Yeah. And he was very decadent. He was. He had concubines and was, and sort of a very different person. He wasn't this embodiment of evil or the heart of darkness, which was Brando's innovation. I mean, obviously he would have discussed it with Coppola, but he then goes away and does these lines. Yeah, I mean, looked into it, and it's all the stuff that he was fascinated by. He was saying, how could you actually make this guy intelligent? How could you make Kurtz a smart person who, in some respects, could justify these terrible acts? And that was the challenge, and that's the stuff he was exploring. But that's all by himself, and he's doing these improvs, and then that's really what was kind of and you can see on the even on the making of For Hearts and Darkness, that's what Brando's doing. He just keep doing this stuff until he dried up. He just riff until and that's what was cut.
Wow. Yeah, I think that ultimately that's why the film works, almost in its transcendent we're all screwed kind of way. But it's following his mental journey as Kurtz, Brando in the role as Kurtz, going further down the metaphorical river. I kind of hear you. I think Brando's wrestling with his own demons there in a weird way sort of saved what was a hellacious shoot. And they're both, he and Coppola had strong personalities, but in a way, many of the things you say that Brando was wrestling with in his own internal struggle of good and evil and fate and free will and life and humanity and hypocrisies, I think it kind of all comes out there in those Kurtz rants. I really do.
Yeah, and I think he wanted to alert the audience to, make them, investigate the nature of evil. He was kind of sort of shining light on that, a topic that, we wouldn't really want to otherwise address. And so rather than the hero or the good guy, he would take on those roles quite purposefully because he wanted to make us confront those questions. It was something a bit didactic and, teacher-like, lecturing about Brando, where he would want to make sure that we understood these things. There was a purpose in that, rather than just indulging his own negativity. He was trying to communicate, things to the audience, for the audience to digest.
Yeah, it's a true exploration, absolutely. What did he have to, compare that? We've talked a lot about him and Coppola. How did he always view that working relationship compared to, say, he and Bertolucci on Tango?
I think it was a different dynamic, as you'd expect. I think Brando appreciated the artist and the competent artist. Somebody who could, justify their vision and explain things and talk them through. He liked guidance, in fact, and he appreciated that. It's a very lonely job being a leading man and going out there, and you need, he really appreciated having someone to bounce off, but that was all too rare. And with Bertolucci, I think that it was a slightly vulnerable time in his life. There was certain I got the feeling he was a little bit more fragile in the background around the shooting of Last Tango 2, and maybe a bit more susceptible to someone like Bertolucci, who was incredibly persuasive and attentive to the actor and would just get down to their level and really try to communicate. And Bertolucci wanted to draw this personal history out of Marlon. He wanted Marlon to be as much of himself on screen.
Yeah.
Which Marlon always never wanted to do, and always say he'd resist it. But I think he also saw the appeal. He was seeking truth he wanted to communicate truth.
Right.
And what better way to actually reveal social truths and personal truths to the audience than actually to reveal your own soul. And I'm pretty convinced that Bertolucci managed to draw that out of him. And I don't know whether it was something that Brando was necessarily proud of when he'd seen the final cut again. He didn't think it was something that maybe he had given too much. And I think he put up a few smoke screens saying that wasn't really him and what have you. But he was. I think he was in that dialogue with Bertolucci. He went to places where he never thought or he never planned to go, and he wanted to go.
Now, pivoting from Bertolucci to Pontecorvo, you mentioned that Burn, 1969 film, was Brando's personal favorite, and I'm sure it's one that a lot of our listeners probably haven't seen, at least compared to a lot of the other more famous movies we've mentioned. But Pontecorvo, man, he made Battle of Algiers a few years before that, I think 66 maybe, and man, that movie is just an all-time masterpiece. And then here in Burn, he works with Brando. So why in your documentary does Brando what does he say about Burn, and why does he hold that up as his own personal favorite accomplishment?
I've just got to be honest. So actually, Burn's not. You see, there's clips of it again, but I don't go into the story of Burn in the documentary. Okay. But I know in terms of why Brando would have chosen that role. Okay. He it just offered so much more besides. It's a commentary on colonialism and greed and this quite sordid diplomacy and realpolitik that would be maneuvered to further themselves and reward, get what they want at the expense of others. Just the sort of thing that Marlon was interested in. Again, he would that toying with these themes of the good and evil within us all, and what motivates us towards evil was why he would have gone with that pick. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. If people are so shocked he sends the Native American statement thing at the Oscars, but really, if you look a couple years earlier at Burn, it's not hard to see why he would sympathize with that sort of a cause. Burn is about British colonialism in the sugar trade going down to the Caribbean, so and kind of taking over down there. So it's a very similar themes here of colonizing and what happens to the indigenous people, sort of a thing he's wrestling with, and it sounds like he had an affinity for Be My Brother's Keeper. At least according to you, this is a fascinating topic.
Well, I think he was, and then he got upset because Burn didn't really hit anyone's radar. It wasn't well marketed. It didn't go anywhere, and that was the sort of thing which left him really disillusioned. He quoted the Hollywood saying that if you've got a message, go to Western Union, and he felt that actually any of message films didn't really attract the bucks and the marketing bucks. That I think was a source of disappointment to him.
It had to be frustrating because then he turned around and do something like Superman and it reaches everybody, but not as much of a message in there. So that had to been a frustrating thing he wrestled with back and forth throughout.
Well, so he calls, he says Superman. Even I'd love Superman as a kid, but Brando said it was a rather silly movie. Right. He just got involved in it because it was paid him millions for a few days' work. Sure. And that was when those describe some of the low points for him. He just wanted to take his money and run. Right. And clock in, and those were just paydays for him, and he didn't really work for much of the 80s after Superman. Yeah. That sort of a nice paid leave for him for best part of a decade.
Exactly. So yeah, was that is that why, as it kind of went into the 80s, did he sort of see the industry shifting sort of more down that route? I mean, we saw kind of an explosion of sequels and, all kinds of, sort of blockbuster culture really kind of took over in that decade. Was there less of a place for a curious social mind like Brando as we kind of forged ahead into the 80s and 90s?
I wonder. I'm trying to think of his roles. He actually got an Oscar. You might
A nomination
know this, but for
you're right.
in 1989,
Dry White Season, yeah.
Dry White Season, which was a very political film, in as much as it dealt with apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
And again, there he's playing a South African. He's showing his race, and I know from speaking to the director of that film that before he went out on set, he would look at photos of the Soweto massacre, where the school children were shot upon by the South African police, but in order to really almost kind of hurt himself and as sensitive as he was, and bring out that emotion so that he can give the best performance possible.
Absolutely. Well, see, that's the thing. There were still movies like that being made, and there are today. They're the great ones. You kind of have to, wade through the culture that the Superman spawned, which we are currently living in now. Tons of superhero movies, but there's still movies like those very, deep social movies like A Dry White Season that are still being done. So, and he was with Donald Sutherland in that too, right? Wow, man. Yeah, I mean, just looking back at the body of work and all the directors he worked with, Pontecorvo, Bertolucci, Coppola, Kazan, who is Guys and Dolls? Was that Mankiewicz, I think? Yeah, Joseph Mankiewicz of All About Eve. Man, I mean, the guy, it's probably no secret that great filmmaking artists are attracted to great acting artists. I mean, that can't be a coincidence there. Let's move into we could sit here and talk about this forever, and you're like, well, we have. But let's move into the final chapter of his life, sort of the, Act 3 that you talked about of the 3 stages of Brando here in the movie. How it kind of ended up with this tragedy that unfolded in his home, where his son literally, commits the murder of his brother-in-law?
I think he was convicted for manslaughter in the end.
Manslaughter.
And it was his his sister's boyfriend, actually the father of his sister's child. She was pregnant at the time.
Wow. Did they how much of your movie do you go into that? Let's say, just for comparison's sake, last week one of the movies I reviewed was Amy, the Amy Winehouse doc, and you kind of, your whole movie, you're kind of wincing because it's going to be hard to watch in the end. How did you deal with, such a sensitive topic, wanting to be respectful to Brando, but at the same time, you need to, you absolutely have to include this in the movie? How did you kind of do that delicate dance for Act 3 there?
I mean, it is and was tricky to somehow nutshell however something like that could ever have happened. Bearing in mind that Christian and I had lots of materials I had access to, tapes that recorded of Christian. I got to know him in a certain way through this body of audio that I could just try and understand what kind of a character he was, and everything suggested a nice boy and then a nice young man, and how could things have then gone so wrong?
Yeah.
So it wasn't seeking to necessarily explain anything other than in certain situations, good people can do terrible things.
Yeah.
And that was and there is sometimes a possible explanation behind that. How do we how are our behaviours dictated, and how could our particular character type ever respond in such a way as to have done something so out of character and so violent. And the thing was, it's an exploration of dysfunctional behaviour that can go right back to the roots of our childhood, and Marlon recognises that it was the same dysfunction that he might have faced, or he did face as a boy, that then very possibly was inherited by his own son.
Which is, as you say that, I get chills, because that's exactly what The Godfather is. You know, you work your whole life in pursuit of, this higher, better life for your son, and in the end, you're saying the son is plagued by the same problems he had. The father becomes the son, as he said in Superman. But it's the theme in Godfather too. It's amazing how this life parallels. It really is.
And yeah, I mean, there are those. I mean, I know. I do know what you're saying. It almost feels a bit too flippant, to compare it to, one of his lead roles. But I mean, there was quite a few instances where, coincidentally, life would be imitating art.
Yeah.
And Marlon would bring so much of the things he was interested in into, as I mentioned, from his own life into his roles. That it was deeply ironic that something like this could have happened, because it's the sort of thing that Marlon was talking about and predicting for many years.
And
where does violence and rage come from?
Yeah, it
was certainly an emotion that he was trying to diagnose and attend to in himself.
Absolutely. Did he? Was there a reason he named him Christian? Was this a spiritual thing, or is there a reasoning behind that?
Do you know, he had a very good friend called Christian Marquand, who was who I'm pretty convinced was the reason that he named Christian after him. He obviously played Fletcher Christian in Beauty and the Bounty, but I don't think he did that.
Right. The old was it a Gable character originally?
The first movie was. Yeah, right. That was Clark Gable playing the same role.
Yep. Whose style you say he did not approve of. All right, cool. Well, I remember when that whole case came out with his son, but I haven't really followed it since. Is he still serving time right now?
No, so he's passed away now. Yeah,
the son
came
passed
out
away.
of he served his time in prison, and then not long after, several years after, he ended up dying from pneumonia, I believe.
Oh wow!
But he'd always been afflicted by that with lung problems from an early age, and actually did, and as did Marlon. It's actually among the illnesses which Marlon had towards the end of his life. Pulmonary fibrosis was one of the things which killed him.
How do you handle sort of the end of his life and the end of his story? What's sort of the final clip of Brando's own, Brando on Brando? We kind of talked about the rosebud analogy. What if he had a final word on his lips in let's say if it was obviously you're making a documentary and you're not there when he has his final word, but what do you think that final word would be to sum up this life?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things he says, which is in the documentary, is he says, when he dies, he wanted to have a microphone placed in his coffin so that he could say, tell everyone to do it differently.
Wow. Why do you think that is?
And that was it. I mean, I think he was just incredibly, that's the one thing, that's the exciting thing, is that for somebody who I know was very insecure, who had the same, worries and concerns that we all have, and the same issues of confidence and definite superiority, that he was actually brave in his profession. And he went outside of his comfort zone. He used to talk about, just go off the high board, and take risks. And a lot of people take the safe route, and that's one thing that can't definitely not be for Brando.
Yeah, I mean, is that something great that you think people go to see this documentary? Let's say our listeners who are interested in one or two of his roles but don't know much about his personal life. What are they gonna walk away from the theater thinking of this life and how they're gonna apply it to how they live?
Well, I hope they'll go in really knowing him, and actually knowing better than they ever thought, because the documentary is entirely in Marlon's own voice. There's not another voice in the film. It's just Brando talking for the full extent, and he's the one who is explaining himself and describing himself and all the things he was fascinated and interested in. I think they'll discover a complete individual, and someone who's very human, and not in an ivory tower of fame, which he always was trying to dismantle through the course of his life. He couldn't stand, being separate from the world. He was someone who was ordinarily very much out there. He wanted to embrace life, and he was and observe and be the voyeur, and that was deprived from him. But even despite that, there's a real sort of like understanding and humanity, and somebody who I really enjoyed spending time with. I was in the company of him in making the film for, the edit was 9 months, and I had him that entire time, just trying to, piece this grand story of his life together. It's all in his own voice, so it's autobiographical in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, you probably feel like he's an old friend at this point. You've spent a lot of time with him. Congrats on on getting the movie out there and the success. I know you were nominated Grand Jury Prize at Sundance, right?
Yeah, that was the world premiere, which was great fun. It was a privilege to be there.
What was it like sitting there, spending so much time on this, obviously putting it together and so much energy and effort, and finally be able to look up and see it on the screen at Sundance? What was that like?
It was fantastic. It's always interesting, to screen it in front of a big audience, and that was the first time. Mm-hmm. So you never quite know how that's going to go, and it was but it was really positive. I think people found that they could connect with the movie, and it was emotional in the right place. And when I say the right place, you yourself have seen that emotion, so that I could feel that from the audience too. But it was interesting. There was some people would turn up which you wouldn't get at a normal screening. There was James Franco came to one, and nice. Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin. I think they're all curious about all things Brando. So that was a nice surprise at Sundance.
So you find that today's actors and filmmakers, the people you mentioned showing up in that room to watch it, there's still a fascination with Brando. Sort of, is it because he was kind of the best of the best at his craft, and people just want to figure out what made him tick? Or, there's still that fascination in today's Hollywood with Brando?
I think all those things. Yeah, he was so and so ambivalent. He would operate at the extremes and was somebody you couldn't put your finger on him. He was always a moving target. But I think in his entirety, as again, I hope the documentary shows, he was incredibly human and someone who was you could relate to. And so it's that humanity which I think is attracting, which attracts people as well. That's a quality you can't ever communicate. But I think it's interesting, even my mum, who's from Montenegro, she remembers watching Brando as a young man. I'd ask her, so what was it about him you remembered? And she goes, she could just tell his spirit and his humanity, this guy. And that was, being communicated with subtitles. So there's all, I think, and going back to the Streetcar and his early roles, the guy was obviously, handsome, in a way that guys can appreciate well enough, we understand as well as women, because he was just, I think he could step out of those films today and be just as popular. He was setting an entire, look and fashion which would pervade the entire 20th century, defined a lot of 20th century cool. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he was there from the get-go. He was the originator and the revolutionary, and so for all these reasons, I think there will always be a fascination in him.
Absolutely. Well, hey, listen, Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us. I think we just passed the hour mark, but it felt like 10 minutes to me, man. It's fascinating stuff. So thanks so much for coming on. You don't know how much I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. Our theme music is Scott Buckley's Clarion. Remember to give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. We'll see you next time.
Explain your DNA on 10 cases, man.
You're inside the police interrogation room with the alleged Potomac River rapist.
I'm not guilty on any of this stuff.
So calm, so reasonable. Could this be the man who terrorized women for 9 years before murdering a brilliant scientist 2 decades ago? Experience one of the most fascinating true crime podcasts available. Join crime reporter Paul Wagner for Unknown Subject, Season 3 of WTOP's American Nightmare series. Search American Nightmare Podcast on all podcast platforms.
I wanted to take a second to tell you about an app I really enjoy. Living in the DC area is great, and Podcast DC gathers all of the local shows that I like all in one local app. Health, sports, local news, politics, and so much more. Podcast DC is the new local app with hundreds of DC area podcasts to choose from. I can earn exciting rewards just for listening and share the podcasts I love instantly. Available in the App Store or in Google Play, listen local with Podcast DC.